Okay, let's start with something you think you know. The elements. Fire, air, water, earth. You know, the stuff we learn about in school.
Right. The basics.
But what if they're not just physical substances? What if they're something much deeper, ancient, maybe even intelligent?
That feeling, that hint of something more, is exactly what we're getting into in this deep dive. We're stepping into well, the rich and often complex world of Theosophy's elemental philosophy.
Yeah, it's pretty dense stuff. And our map for this journey is this stack of your sources, these fascinating excerpts you pulled together. Mostly, it looks like, from H.P. Blavatsky's big work, The Secret Doctrine.
That's the core text, yes. And our mission really is to unpack the key insights from this material. We want to really get what Theosophy is saying about the fundamental building blocks of the cosmos.
And then look at how these ancient ideas might, well, surprisingly intercept with figures you wouldn't expect, like a leading scientist from the late 19th century, Professor William Crookes. That's an interesting connection.
It really is. We'll see how Blavatsky interpreted his work.
Right. So the plan is start at the absolute beginning, the unmanifested source, before anything really is.
Before manifestation.
Then we'll trace how things begin to emerge into the elements we think we recognize, but with these totally different layers of meaning.
Layers are key, yeah.
We'll tackle that pretty radical idea that nature isn't blind, but actually guided by intelligence.
Which is a huge departure from standard views, obviously.
Definitely. Then we'll zero in on the cosmic significance of specific elements like fire and ether, or Akâsha, as Theosophy called it.
They're foundational in this system.
And finally, we'll dive into how Blavatsky saw these, well, echoes or parallels of these ancient teachings and the, cutting-edge scientific ideas of her own time. Okay, let's unpack this.
Okay, so at the absolute beginning, before anything exists in a way we can perceive it, there's this concept that's, well, it's incredibly difficult to really wrap your head around.
Okay.
The core idea is, ultimately, there's only one element in nature. But it's not an element like we think of chemically. It's not a thing.
Not physical.
Not physical at all. It's described as the unknowable rootless root, sometimes called parabram or tat. It's the absolute.
So it's something beyond any kind of scientific measurement or definition, then.
Absolutely. It's the pure, undifferentiated potential, the ground of all being, you could say, before anything manifests. And within this context, the sources bring in Akâsha. It's called the primordial substance.
Okay, Akâsha. But it's not just substance in the way we normally use the word, is it? There's more to it.
Crucially, yes. It's also described as the upadi, which means the basis or the vehicle of divine thought.
Divine thought.
What Theosophy calls mahat, the universal mind.
Okay, wait. So here's maybe the core idea, right? Reality doesn't just start as inert stuff. It starts as thought or consciousness at the very deepest level.
That's absolutely fundamental to this view. Akâsha is like the canvas, maybe, upon which this divine thought projects the universe.
Huh.
All the diversity, all the forms, everything we see and experience, it's all said to emerge from and eventually dissolve back into this ultimate unity. The many come from the one.
Okay, so if everything starts as this unified potential, this one element, how do we get the fire, air, water, and earth that we actually experience? How does that happen?
Well, from that one, there's a process. An unfolding, you can say.
Mm-hmm.
A hierarchy of manifested elements starts to emerge. The sources usually mention 7 levels in this sort of cosmic gradation.
7 levels.
But only 5 are considered fully manifested on our current plane of existence.
And these manifested elements, like fire or water, they aren't seen as fundamental in themselves, like they're not the bottom layer.
Exactly. No. They're described beautifully in one place as the garment, the veil of that deity, referring back to the ultimate one element.
So they're like progressive differentiations, stages of this primordial substance kind of condensing, becoming more material.
That's a good way to think about it. Condensing or differentiating. And they have this septenary in their real cosmic gradation, meaning they exist across different levels, different planes of reality, from the densest physical right up to the purely spiritual.
Which connects to different planes of consciousness, too, presumably.
Precisely. And this gives them a really interesting dual nature when they manifest. They are simultaneously spirit and matter, force and substance.
Okay, so they embody those big cosmic tensions. The text mentions good and evil, force and matter.
Exactly those. And they're seen as active agents in the world, agents of profound dynamics, life and death, health and disease, action and reaction.
So they're not just passive building blocks waiting to be used. They're active principles,
Yeah.
driving things, embodying cosmic forces.
Yes, absolutely. They're imbued with qualitative power
Yeah.
and, importantly, with intelligence.
Intelligence. Okay, that leads us to another pretty radical idea from these sources, doesn't it?
It does. Theosophy flat out asserts that elemental nature, what we see around us, is not governed by blind, random mechanical forces.
Wait, hang on. So the wind blowing or fire burning, that's not just physics as we understand it. There's more going on.
Not just physics in the purely mechanical, materialistic sense, no. The sources state that the visible elements, fire, air, water, earth, and the synthesizing element ether or Akâsha, are actually just the visible garb, the symbols of the informing invisible souls or spirits, the cosmic gods.
Cosmic gods. So behind the physical stuff we see, there are conscious entities guiding things.
That's the picture painted here, yes. These are called the Dhyan Chohans, sometimes translated as lords of meditation. They're presented as the guiding intelligences, the true unseen realities, the noumena behind the phenomena of the elements.
Okay. Dhyan Chohans.
And then operating at a sort of lower level are the elementals, or nature spirits, different hierarchies of beings.
Right, I've heard of elementals, and they're the ones actually interacting with the physical world more directly, like making things happen.
They're seen as mediating the actions of the elements on the material planes, yeah, acting almost like executive agents for the higher intelligences. The occult view, as presented here, is that behind every physical effect, there's a conscious guiding noumenon thereof, angel or god, spirit or demon-ruling powers. These are sometimes called the sons of Fohat, Fohat being this primordial cosmic energy. So these sons are essentially personified natural forces, each with its own level of intelligence or consciousness directing how elements behave.
It really raises a huge question, doesn't it? Is everything in nature, down to the smallest process, actually guided by some level of intelligence, according to this view?
That's the implication. It completely shifts the perspective from, a dead mechanical universe to one that's fundamentally alive and conscious at every single level.
Totally. Okay, let's zoom in a bit then. The sources highlight a couple of elements as particularly significant in this ancient framework. The underlying idea, again, is that all elements are dual spiritual and material, and ancient philosophers apparently saw them as incorporeal principles.
Yes, that non-physical spiritual aspect is absolutely key. And fire really stands out in these texts. It's presented as far more than just combustion. It's seen as a fundamental cosmic principle, described as the most divine and mystic.
Divine and mystic, like the ultimate creative force. Or transformative energy.
Both and more. There's talk of a universal or sacred fire, which is called a truth-revealing principle, a direct manifestation of the divine will, even the Father of Light.
Truth-revealing.
Yeah, and then there's mystic or Kabbalistic fire, which is linked specifically to cosmic creation and also to human spiritual development transformation. The sources even mention the Zendavesta, the ancient Persian scriptures, connecting fire specifically to knowledge of the future, science, and amiable speech. So linking it directly to higher states of consciousness, insight, and even effective communication.
So fire isn't just about physical heat or destruction or energy. It's deeply tied to knowledge, spiritual insight, consciousness itself.
Profoundly so, according to this view. And the source gets quite specific, referencing a Puranic, an ancient Hindu classification of 3 primary types of fire.
Okay.
There's Pavaka, which is described as electric fire, linked to that cosmic energy, Fohat. Then Pavamana, which is fire produced by friction, but interpreted mystically as awakened spiritual energy like Kundalini. And Suchi, which is solar fire, seen as the source of prana, the vital life force.
Wow, specific functions for different fires.
Exactly. And the key point Blavatsky makes is every fire has a distinct function, has a corresponding relation to one of the human psychic faculties. He goes further, saying each of the 7 human principles, or layers of being, has its own corresponding fire.
So fire is woven through everything: creation, transformation, purification, revelation in the cosmos and within us.
That's the essence of it, a primary power.
Okay, fire is clearly way more than just heat and light here. What about ether, or Akâsha? You mentioned it earlier as the primordial substance. Where does that fit in more detail?
Akâsha holds an absolutely paramount position. Now, the concept of ether that was debated in 19th century science, Blavatsky, saw that as just a lower, more manifested principle of the ultimate Akâsha.
So scientific ether was like a shadow of the real thing.
Sort of, yeah. Akâsha itself, in its highest aspect, is the upadhi. Remember, the eternal basis or vehicle of divine thought, Mahat.
So it's not just passive empty space, it's the active spiritual substrate for the universal mind.
Precisely. It's called the quintessence of all possible energy, and the universal agent for all manifestations of energy, whether that's physical, psychic, or spiritual.
So all forces are just variations within Akâsha.
All known scientific forces like gravity or electromagnetism are seen as just differentiations of this one single universal energy operating within Akâsha. It's the source and the universal conductor of all vibrations and forces cohesion, chemical affinity, you name it.
Wow.
The source even links it explicitly to the nervous system in humans and to the subtle body, the linga sarira, or etheric double.
It sounds like this omnipresent, conscious energy field that holds everything together, and it's the vehicle for life itself.
That's a good way to put it. It's described as unchangeable, indestructible, and invisible in its own essence, pervading everything. And crucially, it's called the life-giving principle.
The source of life.
Yeah. Without ether meaning Akâsha here, there could be no motion, no impulse from Fohat. It determines the constitution of bodies and connects sun with planet, planet with planet, and man with man.
That's huge.
It is. Akâsha is presented as this omnipresent, active, intelligent, spiritual substance principle. It's the source and the vehicle of all forces, all energies, all life. It holds divine thought and is activated by divine energy. Fohat.
That paints a radically different picture of the universe's underlying fabric than, empty space plus particles.
It's completely different.
Okay, so we've got fire and Akâsha as these incredibly potent principles. What about water and air? How do they fit into this symbolic occult view? Are they just lesser elements?
Not lesser, but they have distinct and very ancient symbolic and occult roles, drawing heavily from cosmogony myths. Water, for example, is often depicted as the primordial matrix, the waters of space, the mother deep.
The source from which everything arises.
Exactly. It represents the passive, feminine, receptive principle. It's the substance that receives the seed of divine thought to kickstart creation. It symbolizes both potential life and the unformed primordial cosmic substance, the great deep, or sometimes the great dragon, before order emerges. Chaos and potential.
Okay, the feminine receptive matrix. And air.
Air is fundamentally linked to spirit. Pneuma, spiritus. The ancient world often used the same word for wind, air, and spirit.
The breath of life idea?
Precisely. It signifies that vital force. Vayu, the Hindu principle of air, isn't just atmospheric gas. It's seen as a fundamental cosmic principle, a subtle state of matter that's guided by those Dhyan Chohans we mentioned earlier.
So water and air aren't just stuff either. They represent these foundational states of cosmic substance. They embody creative potentials and act as vehicles for spirit, for prana, the life breath.
Exactly. They complete the picture of these foundational, intelligent, spiritual, material principles.
Okay. So we have this ancient wisdom framework, this theosophical view, where elements are living, intelligent spiritual principles, all unfolding from a single source in cycles. And this is where it gets really intriguing, right? Because the sources then pivot to suggest that Blavatsky saw modern science, specifically the work of this Professor William Crookes, actually starting to, echo some of these profound ancient truths, maybe without even realizing it.
Yes, this is where Theosophy makes a pretty bold claim, that empirical science, when it pushes its boundaries, might inadvertently start to glimpse these deeper esoteric realities. Blavatsky looked closely at Crookes' research. He was a major physicist and chemist, inventor of the Crookes tube.
Right, a serious scientist.
A very serious scientist. She looked at his work on the nature of chemical elements and found what she interpreted as really striking parallels to Theosophical doctrine.
Like his idea of protyle, that elements weren't fundamental but might have evolved from some simpler substance.
Exactly that. Crookes speculated about elements not being truly simple, maybe evolving from simpler matters or even from one sole kind of matter, which he tentatively named protyle, or first matter. He talked about meta-elements, suggesting a spectrum or continuum rather than sharply distinct fixed elements.
And his experiments showed this.
His work, particularly with rare earth elements like yttrium, revealed these incredibly minute shades of difference between substances that were almost identical chemically. This hinted to him that elements might be more complex or composite than previously thought.
Okay.
And fascinatingly, Crookes himself posed the question, if elements evolved, what was the directive force that guided atoms to select their specific properties and places in the periodic system?
The directive force.
Which, for Blavatsky, was like a scientific intuition, pointing directly towards those guiding intelligences she talked about Fohat, the Dhyan Chohans. the forces behind the physical process.
And she explicitly connected Crookes's scientific concept of protyle to the Eastern occult doctrines, things like mula prakriti or pratana.
Directly. She saw his hypothesis about a primordial, undifferentiated matter as science beginning to touch upon this ultimate, unmanifest spiritual substratum, mula prakriti.
Even though he was talking physics, she saw metaphysics.
Essentially, yes. There's a quote where she says his protyle has simply passed into that plane, which is no plane to our physical senses, but the eternal state of everything beyond the planes of illusion. She felt his science was peering beyond the veil of purely physical matter.
And even his speculations about elements lighter than hydrogen, things like helium, before it was properly isolated.
Right. His hypothesis of elements existing in stars that weren't yet found on Earth, or states of matter beyond detection, she saw that as resonating strongly with theosophical ideas about subtle elements and planes of matter beyond our current scientific grasp.
So she saw his empirical work, his actual lab work, and theoretical physics as pointing towards this deeper, unmanifest reality described in esoteric texts, even if he wasn't using that language himself.
That was her interpretation, yes.
And he also proposed an actual evolutionary model for how the elements might have formed, right?
Yeah.
Not just that they came from protyle, but how.
Yes, he did. He envisioned the elements differentiating out from this original protyle under the influence of several factors, primarily time, a progressive lowering of temperature, and electricity, which he vividly described as acting like a mighty pendulum, swinging back and forth and somehow influencing the formation process. Blavatsky immediately equated this electrical force with Fohat, that driving cosmic energy. And space, of course, was the field where this happened.
And he used that distinctive visual model, didn't he? The figure of 8, or lemniscate.
Yes, that famous looping figure 8 diagram. He proposed that some vis generatrix, a generating force, which Blavatsky again identified as Fohat, followed this lemniscate path through space and time.
Okay.
As temperature dropped, this force would scatter clusters of primitive matter, protoatoms, you might say, along this path. And depending on where they landed on the loops, they would condense or aggregate into the different chemical elements and families we observe in the periodic table.
And Blavatsky saw this scientific model, this figure 8,
as a direct scientific parallel to the ancient occult concept of cyclic evolution. The idea of matter descending from spirit down into denser forms, reaching a turning point, and then reascending back toward spirit through evolutionary cycles. The lemniscate path visually represented that descent and ascent.
That ties in perfectly with the whole theosophical idea of periodicity, doesn't it? Crookes actually concluded that atoms weren't eternal or indestructible, but were subject to processes of decay and death.
Yes, he did. He saw them as manufactured articles, implying they had a beginning and potentially an end. And that conclusion strongly supported the core theosophical doctrine that everything in the cosmos, even atoms, is subject to periodicity.
They are born at Manvantara, the cosmic cycle of activity or manifestation.
And they die or dissolve at pralaya, the corresponding cycle of cosmic rest or dissolution. Everything cycles.
And there was another point in his model, right? A neutral point.
Yes. In his figure 8 model, the point where the lines cross, the center of the 8, he described as being neutral as to electricity and chemical energy. Blavatsky saw this as directly analogous to the Laya state, or 0 point, in occultism.
The Laya, meaning?
The state of undifferentiated primordial substance mula prakriti, again during pralaya, the period of cosmic rest, before differentiation begins again. It's the point of perfect equilibrium, the absolute 0 point from which manifestation arises and to which it returns.
Wow. And even his classification attempts, he tentatively grouped elements into 7 primary clusters.
Which, of course, immediately resonated with Blavatsky because of the constant emphasis on septenary divisions in occult philosophy. The idea that 7 is a fundamental structuring principle in the cosmos, from planes of existence to human principles.
So the parallels seemed quite extensive from her perspective.
They did. The sources actually summarize them quite neatly. You've got Crookes's protyle aligning with mula prakriti, his evolutionary genesis aligning with cosmic evolution via cyclic law, his lemniscate figure mapping onto the cyclic descent and reascent of spirit matter, his point neutral matching the Laya state.
His idea of atoms subject to decay matching cosmic periodicity.
Right. His 7 groupings echoing septenary principles. His intuition about a directive force pointing to intelligent forces like Fohat and the Dhyan Chohans. His hypothesis of helium hinting at elements beyond normal detection. Even his model of evolution starting from knots and voids in space resonating with concepts of primordial chaos or space before structured manifestation.
It's really quite something. What strikes me here, and probably strikes you listening, is this idea that a leading, respected scientist in the late 19th century, working purely from physical observation, experiment, and hypothesis,
Hmm.
might have been independently arriving at concepts that echo, sometimes quite strongly, these ancient, esoteric, non-materialistic cosmologies. It's not about saying Crookes proved theosophy or vice versa,
No, not at all.
but it's about seeing these potential points of convergence, these unexpected resonances between very different ways of trying to understand reality. So, okay, what does all of this really mean for you, the listener, today? Why should you care about these, frankly, quite complex and abstract ideas?
Well, I think the reason to spend time exploring these ideas is because they offer such a radically different lens to view the physical world we all inhabit. They
Mhm.
fundamentally challenge the common everyday assumption that the elements, the ground beneath your feet, the air you breathe, are just inert, unintelligent stuff.
Right. Dead matter.
Exactly. Instead, this perspective proposes a universe where the very building blocks are alive, dynamic, evolving principles imbued with consciousness, guided by intelligence.
It really pushes back hard against a purely materialistic worldview, doesn't it? And it opens up these huge questions about the nature of consciousness itself. Where does it come from? Is it fundamental? What about energy? And the basic architecture of the universe.
It does all of that. And it's also about seeing potential connections, exploring the possibility that different systems of knowledge, ancient wisdom traditions, and modern scientific inquiry might not be entirely separate. They might be asking similar questions, maybe even catching glimpses of the same underlying reality, just using different languages and methods, finding surprising echoes.
It certainly invites you to look at the world around you with maybe different eyes, to consider the possibility that it's far more alive, interconnected, and maybe even intentional than you might have previously imagined.
That's a great way to put it.
So, to recap, we've taken this deep dive into Theosophy's view, drawn mainly from Blavatsky, that elements are profoundly more than just physical components. They're seen as spiritual principles, emanating from a single, ultimate, unknowable source,
Unfolding in great cosmic cycles.
evolving cyclically and guided by conscious, intelligent forces from the highest cosmic gods down to the elementals. And we saw how proponents like Blavatsky found these really intriguing hints, these perceived parallels of these profound ancient ideas, even in the cutting-edge scientific work of her time, specifically looking at someone like Professor William Crookes.
It paints this picture of a cosmos that isn't just vast and complex, but fundamentally alive, conscious, and deeply interconnected at all levels.
And that really leaves us and leaves you with a powerful thought to maybe sit with. If the very building blocks of the world around us, and indeed within us, are fundamentally connected to consciousness, maybe even our consciousness in some form, and are guided by intelligence, what implications does that actually have?
Yeah, what does that mean for how we perceive nature, how we interact with our environment, how we understand our own place within this whole cosmic system?
Does it maybe hint that the separation we tend to feel, that deep split between spirit and matter, between mind and world, is perhaps ultimately an illusion, maybe the greatest illusion of all? It's certainly a perspective that invites some serious contemplation.